George Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion, 1794. Washington survived 8 years of war against the most powerful military on earth. He thought the hard part was over. He was wrong. In 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania stopped paying the federal whiskey tax and started burning down the homes of tax collectors. Armed militias formed. 6,000 men marched on Pittsburgh. The Constitution was 4 years old, and there was a very real possibility it wouldn't survive. If Washington backed down, every state with a grievance would know that showing up with guns was an effective strategy. Washington did something no president has done before or since. He personally led 12,000 militia troops into Pennsylvania. He didn't stay for the full campaign. He handed command to General Henry Lee and returned to Philadelphia. But the message was unmistakable. The President of the United States would ride out to meet an insurrection himself if he had to. The rebellion collapsed before a shot was fired. The federal government's authority to enforce its own laws was established in the clearest possible terms, at gunpoint, if necessary. Washington had answered the most fundamental question the new republic had ever faced. What happens when citizens with guns decide they don't like the rules? Now everyone knew. John Adams. The Quasi-War with France. 1798 to 1800. France had been seizing American merchant ships, over 300 of them. And when Adams sent diplomats to Paris, French agents demanded a bribe before any talks would happen. The American public erupted. Congress authorized warships. War fever was real and building fast. Adams authorized a naval buildup, and American ships started fighting French ships in the Caribbean. But then he did something his own party couldn't forgive. He looked at the full picture, saw that France under Napoleon was open to a deal, and sent a new diplomatic mission over the furious objections of his cabinet. The mission succeeded. The war that never officially started was over. Adams almost certainly prevented a conflict the young country might not have survived. His own Federalist Party never forgave him. He lost the 1800 election and retired to Massachusetts, convinced he'd done the right thing. He was right. It just didn't save his career. Thomas Jefferson. The Barbary Wars, 1801 to 1805. The Barbary states of North Africa had been demanding tribute payments from American ships for years. Jefferson inherited a government that was essentially paying protection money to pirates. He refused to keep paying. Tripoli declared war. Jefferson sent a naval squadron to the Mediterranean without formally asking Congress, a legally complicated move he handled by simply not making a public announcement about it, and began a 4-year campaign. The low point came when the USS Philadelphia ran aground in Tripoli Harbor and her crew of 300 men was captured and held for ransom. Jefferson refused to negotiate. Instead, he sent a former consul named William Eaton with a small force of Marines and a hired army of Arab cavalry across 500 miles of Libyan desert to storm the city of Derna. That battle is where, "To the shores of Tripoli," in the Marines' hymn comes from. Tripoli signed a treaty, the prisoners came home, and Jefferson had established that the United States would fight rather than pay, a precedent that defined American foreign policy for generations. James Madison. The Burning of Washington, 1814. August 24, 1814. British troops march into Washington, D.C., while the President of the United States flees on horseback. They burn the Capitol, the Treasury, and the White House. Dolly Madison is still inside the executive mansion when they arrive. She loads a wagon with government documents and a portrait of George Washington and gets out 20 minutes before British soldiers sit down at the dinner table Madison had set for 40 guests, eat the meal, and then set the building on fire. The burning of Washington was the lowest point any sitting American president had faced, a foreign military force occupying and torching the Capitol. A violent thunderstorm that night put out many of the fires and reportedly killed British soldiers with a tornado. Madison regrouped, the British withdrew, and Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans salvaged enough national pride that Madison could claim the war hadn't been a complete disaster. Historians still argue about whether it was. Abraham Lincoln. Fort Sumter, 1861. Lincoln had been president for 6 weeks when Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, April 12, 1861. He inherited a country already fracturing, 7 states gone, a military so small it couldn't defend the capital, and a response that couldn't trigger the border states into seceding too. If Maryland left, Washington, D.C. would be surrounded by Confederate territory. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers, declared a naval blockade, suspended habeas corpus, allowing civilians to be detained without trial in areas near the front lines, and did all of it without calling Congress back into session. He simply acted and asked Congress to ratify it afterward. Virginia seceded 4 days later, but the border states held, barely. Lincoln had bought enough time to build an army. What followed was 4 years and 600,000 dead, and a president who rewrote the legal and moral foundations of the country while fighting to keep it from tearing in two. At the end of it, the country was still, barely, one country. Woodrow Wilson, The Zimmermann Telegram, 1917. Wilson had won re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The American public wanted nothing to do with a European conflict that had already killed millions. Then British intelligence intercepted a German telegram offering Mexico a military alliance against the United States, in exchange for help reclaiming Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Germany also announced it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any ship, including American vessels, starting February 1st. When the Zimmermann telegram broke publicly in late February, the shift in opinion was almost immediate. Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war on April 2, 1917. 2 million American soldiers eventually reached France. Wilson spent the rest of his presidency trying to build a peace architecture that might prevent the next World War, suffered a massive stroke while campaigning for it, and failed to get Senate ratification of the League of Nations. The next World War started 20 years after the armistice he helped negotiate. Franklin Roosevelt, Pearl Harbor, 1941, December 7, 1941. 2,403 Americans killed, 18 naval vessels sunk or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, all in under 2 hours. Roosevelt had been maneuvering toward the war for 2 years against a deeply isolationist public. The attack solved his political problem and created a military catastrophe in the same morning. The decision that would follow him beyond his death came in February 1942, when he signed the order authorizing the forced relocation of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. 2/3 of them were American citizens. They lost their homes, businesses, and property. The Supreme Court upheld it. Congress apologized and paid reparations 46 years later. Roosevelt also shepherded the Manhattan Project into existence, though he died before the bomb was used. The man who authorized both the internment of American citizens and the weapon that ended the war died in April 1945, 13 days before Germany surrendered. Harry Truman, The Atomic Bomb, 1945. Truman had been vice president for 82 days when Roosevelt died. Nobody had told him about the Manhattan Project. His Secretary of War briefed him the day after he was sworn in. He had to decide whether to use the most destructive weapon ever built against a country that still hadn't surrendered despite years of conventional bombing. Military planners estimated an invasion of the Japanese home islands could cost between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. Truman authorized the bomb. Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. Somewhere between 70 and 80,000 killed instantly, tens of thousands more in the months that followed. Nagasaki, 3 days later. Japan surrendered August 15th. Truman maintained for the rest of his life that the decision saved more lives than it cost. The debate has never stopped. What isn't debated is that August 6, 1945, started a clock that every president since has had to live with. Dwight Eisenhower, nuclear brinkmanship, and Korea, 1953. Eisenhower inherited a war that had been grinding for 3 years with no end in sight. Korea had already cost over 30,000 American lives, and there was no clear path to victory. His predecessor had fired the theater commander, Douglas MacArthur, for publicly advocating the use of nuclear weapons and an expanded war against China. Eisenhower's response was characteristically indirect. He let it be known through diplomatic back channels that he was not ruling out nuclear weapons if the stalemate continued, and that things might escalate in ways nobody could predict. Whether it was this implied threat or other factors, the armistice was signed in July 1953. The Korean War ended, or rather, it paused. Eisenhower had stopped the shooting without solving the conflict. The armistice is still technically in place today, which is the kind of outcome that looks like success until you're still managing the consequences 70 years later. John F. Kennedy, The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. 13 days. Kennedy's Joint Chiefs wanted airstrikes. His Bay of Pigs failure, 18 months earlier, had convinced Khrushchev he was weak and could be pushed. Kennedy chose a naval quarantine and sent Khrushchev a letter that was firm but quietly offered a way out. Remove the missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. would publicly pledge not to invade Cuba and privately remove American missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev took the deal. What Kennedy didn't know, what wouldn't become public for decades, was how close the non-public events had come to catastrophe. A Soviet submarine had lost contact with Moscow, was being depth-charged by American destroyers, and its captain had ordered a nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. One officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to authorize it. He is the man most historians credit with preventing nuclear war. Kennedy never knew his name. Lyndon Johnson, the Gulf of Tonkin, 1964, August 4, 1964. Johnson told Congress that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin for the second time in 2 days. Congress passed a resolution giving him essentially unlimited authority to escalate in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The first attack, on August 2nd, was real. The second almost certainly never happened. Johnson reportedly told an aide privately, "For all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there." He asked for war powers anyway. Over 58,000 Americans and an estimated 2 million Vietnamese died in the war that followed. Johnson decided not to seek re-election in 1968, destroyed by a conflict he'd escalated on the basis of an attack that may never have happened. He died 5 years later at his Texas ranch. The war was still going. Jimmy Carter, the Iran hostage crisis, 1979 to 1981, November 4th, 1979. Iranian students storm the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and take 66 Americans hostage. Carter tried negotiation, sanctions, and diplomacy through intermediaries. None of it worked. In April 1980, he authorized a military rescue mission that ended when 3 helicopters malfunctioned in a desert staging area, and a collision between a helicopter and a transport aircraft killed 8 American servicemen. The hostages weren't anywhere near the crash site. Carter had bet his presidency on the rescue and lost. The Iranians waited until the exact moment Ronald Reagan was inaugurated on January 20th, 1981, to release the hostages. A deliberate final humiliation timed to deny Carter any political benefit from their freedom. Carter never recovered politically. The hostages came home alive, all 66 of them. Ronald Reagan, Beirut, 1983, October 23, 1983. A suicide bomber drives a truck carrying the equivalent of 12,000 pounds of TNT into the U.S. Marine barracks at Beirut International Airport. The building collapses. 241 American servicemen are killed, the deadliest single-day loss for U.S. forces since Iwo Jima. Reagan gave a speech promising the United States would not be driven out by terrorists. 4 months later, he withdrew the Marines. The decision drew accusations of retreat that followed American foreign policy for decades. Osama bin Laden later cited Beirut explicitly as proof that America would retreat if hit hard enough. Reagan believed staying without a clear mission would cost more American lives. He was probably right about the math. The strategic consequences were something else entirely. George H.W. Bush. The Gulf War, 1991. August 2nd, 1990. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait with 100,000 troops and 4,000 tanks, and controls 20% of the world's oil reserves overnight. Bush spent 6 months building a 34-nation coalition, then authorized Operation Desert Storm, 42 days of air war, a 100-hour ground campaign, and Iraqi forces expelled from Kuwait with only 147 Americans killed in action. Bush stopped short of marching to Baghdad. His rationale: the UN mandate covered liberation of Kuwait, not regime change, and toppling Saddam would shatter the coalition and create a power vacuum nobody had a plan to fill. Nobody listened to that argument carefully enough in 2003. Bill Clinton, Al-Qaeda and the Missed Chances, 1993 to 2000. Clinton's hardest national security crisis is the one that didn't happen on his watch but arguably should have been stopped before it did. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the 1998 embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania that killed over 200 people, the 2000 bombing of the USS Cole that killed 17 sailors. Al-Qaeda was building, attacking, and openly declaring war on the United States, and the intelligence community was increasingly certain something larger was being planned. Clinton ordered cruise missile strikes on Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan in 1998. The strikes hit empty camps. Bin Laden had left hours earlier, and they were widely mocked as a distraction from the Monica Lewinsky scandal. The 9/11 Commission documented how close the intelligence community came to disrupting the eventual plot on multiple occasions during Clinton's final year in office. Close wasn't enough. He handed his successor a detailed briefing on Al-Qaeda as the primary threat to U.S. national security and a problem that had no solution yet. George W. Bush. September 11, 2001. 4 planes hijacked. 2 hit the World Trade Center. 1 hits the Pentagon. 1 goes down in a Pennsylvania field after passengers rush the cockpit. 2,977 people killed. Bush is at an elementary school in Florida when his chief of staff whispers in his ear that a second plane has hit the second tower. He sits in front of 20 children for 7 minutes, holding a book called My Pet Goat. That stillness, preserved on camera, becomes one of the most debated images in American presidential history. The decisions that followed define the next 2 decades: Afghanistan, the Patriot Act, the Department of Homeland Security, and the invasion of Iraq on the assertion that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, a claim that proved false. Over 7,000 American military personnel died in the wars that followed. The United States is still dealing with the consequences. Barack Obama. The Bin Laden Raid, 2011. May 1, 2011. Obama authorizes a helicopter raid into Abbottabad, Pakistan, on a compound where intelligence analysts believe Osama bin Laden may be hiding. The key word is may. CIA confidence ranged from 40 to 80%, depending on who was in the room. His vice president said, "Wait." His CIA director said, "Go." Obama thought about it overnight and gave the order. One of the 2 Black Hawks crashed on landing inside the compound walls. Navy SEALs killed bin Laden on the 2nd floor. DNA confirmation came within hours. What the public didn't see was how close the whole thing came to unraveling in the first 60 seconds, and that the trail to that compound had begun nearly a decade earlier with a single name, the alias of bin Laden's personal courier. Donald Trump. The Soleimani Strike, 2020. January 2, 2020. A U.S. drone strike kills Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani at Baghdad International Airport, the commander of Iran's Quds Force, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American soldiers through proxy networks in Iraq. Trump authorized the strike after Iranian-backed militias attacked a U.S. base and stormed the embassy compound in Baghdad. Iran responded with ballistic missile strikes on American bases. Over 100 U.S. service members suffered traumatic brain injuries. Both sides stepped back. The strike's legal authorization was immediately questioned, and the administration's justification shifted several times in the days that followed. It remains one of the most consequential and contested unilateral military decisions of the modern era. Joe Biden. The fall of Kabul, 2021. August 15, 2021. The Taliban rolls into Kabul and the Afghan government collapses in hours, not the weeks or months American intelligence had predicted. Videos spread instantly of Afghans clinging to the outside of U.S. military aircraft as they lift off the runway. Biden followed through on a withdrawal agreement his predecessor had negotiated, setting an August 31st deadline for full removal. The collapse caught everyone off guard, including his own intelligence services. The chaotic evacuation that followed extracted roughly 124,000 people in 2 weeks. 13 American service members were killed in a suicide bombing at the airport gate. Biden said he stood by the decision to end a 20-year war that had cost over $2 trillion. The fall of Kabul defined the final image of America's longest war.